The desert was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The sky glowed orange over the far hills, and the dry wind carried the smell of dust, gunpowder, and regret. She stood near the broken fence of her ranch, her fingers trembling as she tried to fix a strand of her red hair behind her ear. The air was heavy, and her heart beat so loudly she could almost hear it. That was when he appeared again, the Apache warrior she'd once feared. The same man who had saved her life a week ago when her wagon had broken near the canyon. His dark eyes watched her like he could read every secret she'd ever tried to bury. He didn't belong here. Not among her people. Not this close to her home. Not when her husband was only a few miles away hunting strays with his men. Yet something about the way he stood, proud, silent, unafraid, made the world around her blur. The last time she had seen him, he had said nothing. He had simply offered her water when she was dying of thirst under the blazing sun. Now he was here again, closer than she ever thought he'd dare to be. The wind caught the feathers in his hair, and his chest bore the marks of a warrior, strong and carved like the land he came from. She could smell the smoke and wild herbs on him, the scent of the wilderness itself. She whispered, almost to herself, "You shouldn't have come." Her voice broke at the end, because even she didn't believe her own words. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching over the sand, his expression unreadable. "You called me," he said quietly. His English was rough, but the tone made her shiver. She wanted to deny it, to tell him she had forgotten everything that happened that night in the canyon. But she couldn't, because somewhere deep inside, she had wanted him to come back. She had felt it every time the wind blew from the south, that strange pull. The memory of his eyes under the moonlight. The air between them was charged, tense, alive. The warrior's hand brushed the edge of her arm, slow and careful, as if testing whether she would pull away. She didn't. Every part of her told her to run. To remember who she was, the wife of a man who owned half this valley. The woman who sat in church every Sunday pretending her marriage wasn't falling apart. But there was something in this Apache's gaze that stripped away the lies she lived under. He looked at her like she was still alive. "Don't kiss me," she whispered, her breath trembling against the desert air. She could hear the horses in the distance, the faint creak of the windmill behind the barn, and the slow beat of her own heart. "Don't." But even as she said it, her hands didn't move away from his chest. He leaned closer, the warmth of his breath brushing her lips. His eyes didn't ask for permission. They claimed the moment like a man who had nothing left to lose. When his lips met hers, it was not soft or sweet. It was raw, wild, and forbidden. The kind of kiss that broke rules written by men who had never felt hunger like this. For a brief second, the world disappeared. No fences, no ranch, no husband, no tribe. Only two lost souls trapped between duty and desire. The sky dimmed behind the hills, and the wind howled across the plain. She felt something inside her unravel, something she had buried for years. He tasted of smoke and freedom. She clung to him like the desert clings to rain, desperate, fleeting, knowing it can't last. Then came the sound. A single click, cold, sharp, unmistakable. The sound of a rifle being cocked. Her body froze. The Apache's eyes narrowed, and he turned his head slightly, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. But it was too late. A man's voice cut through the wind, low and shaking with fury. "Get away from her." Her blood went cold. Her husband stood only a few yards away, his face twisted in disbelief and rage. The rifle trembled in his hands, but his aim was steady. Dust swirled around his boots as the wind picked up, and the last trace of sunlight fell across his hat. The warrior stepped back slightly, his body tense, ready to fight. But she knew one wrong move, and someone would die before the sun went down. "Put the gun down," she begged, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." The lie felt heavy on her tongue. Her husband laughed bitterly, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Then what the hell is it?" he spat. His eyes flicked to the Apache's bare chest, to her trembling hands. To the look she didn't realize was still written across her face. "You think I can't see it?" he growled. The Apache didn't speak. He stood still, his hand half raised, calm but alert. Every muscle in his body was ready. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen, a triangle of betrayal, love, and vengeance drawn in the dust. Her husband's face changed. The rage flickered into something else: pain, disbelief, heartbreak. He had always been a hard man, built by the land and the years of drought and debt. But right then, he looked broken. She wanted to speak, to tell him the truth, that she had never meant for this to happen. That loneliness can drive even the strongest hearts into strange places. But no words came. The silence stretched heavy and unbearable. The Apache's eyes shifted between them. He knew the danger. He could feel the tension in the air like a bowstring about to snap. Slowly, he took one step back, his gaze still fixed on her. "I didn't come for war," he said quietly. "But if he fires, I won't fall alone." Her husband's jaw clenched. His finger hovered on the trigger. The desert held its breath. The only sound was the moaning of the wind through the dry grass. She stepped forward, her hands raised, tears burning in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this." But fate was cruel. In that single heartbeat, the horse tied behind the fence neighed loudly, spooked by the rising wind. Her husband flinched, and the rifle went off. The sound ripped through the silence, echoing across the canyon walls. A cloud of dust rose where the bullet struck, and a scream tore from her throat. The Apache stumbled back, but the look in his eyes was not fear. It was something else, something deeper. Her husband dropped the rifle in shock, as if he couldn't believe what he had done. She ran forward, the ground uneven beneath her boots, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. She didn't know who had been hit, or if the bullet had missed entirely. The warrior stood still for a moment, staring at her with an expression that burned itself into her memory. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the red dust between them. He turned and ran toward the open desert, vanishing into the wild that had birthed him. Her husband called her name, his voice breaking. But she didn't turn around. As the last light of the day faded behind the hills, she stood alone between them, the man she had promised to love, and the man who had stolen her heart without a word. The echo of the gunshot still hung in the air, a sound that would never leave her. Somewhere in the distance, the coyotes began to howl, and she knew this was only the beginning of the storm that was about to fall upon them all. The days that followed were wrapped in a strange, breathless silence. The echo of the gunshot still lingered around the ranch like a ghost that refused to leave. Every time the wind shifted, it carried that same metallic echo across the valley, reminding her of what had happened and what she could not undo. Her husband barely spoke after that night. He came home late, his boots covered in dust, his face unreadable. She tried to speak to him once, to ask what he had seen, but the words died on her lips. The look in his eyes said enough anger, confusion, and something worse, pain too deep to measure. The morning after the shot, she had gone back to the same spot in the desert where it happened. The ground still bore the faint mark of struggle, the hoofprints, the torn grass, the blood. She didn't know if the Apache had been hit or not. There was no body, no trail of blood leading away. Only silence, the kind that eats you from the inside. She found one of his feathers lying near the rock, dark and stiff with dust. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she took it home. She hid it in the small wooden box where she kept her wedding ring whenever she couldn't bear to wear it. The people in town started talking soon after. Someone claimed they had seen a strange figure near the canyon ridge. Someone else said the Apache warriors were gathering again in the south. Her husband listened to every rumor, every whisper, his jaw set like stone. He began carrying his rifle wherever he went, even to supper. She could see how the suspicion hollowed him out day by day, how he started looking at every stranger as if they were an enemy. He wasn't always like that before the war, before the drought, before the endless fights over land and cattle. He had been a different man, proud, sure, even gentle in his way. She remembered when they first came to this valley, when the ranch was just a small house and 2 mules. He had built it with his hands, one board at a time. They used to laugh at night, sitting by the fire, dreaming about a life they could one day share. But time and loss can turn love into something colder. The drought had stolen their crops, the bank had stolen their peace, and silence had stolen their marriage. She often wondered if the Apache had seen that the loneliness that had crept into her heart long before he appeared. The day he saved her in the canyon had been brutal. She'd been on her way to town when her horse slipped near the edge, and the wagon rolled halfway down the slope. He had been there, watching from the shadows, and she had been too frightened to speak when he approached. But he had offered her water, torn a strip from his own tunic to bandage her arm, and guided her safely back to the trail. He didn't ask for anything in return. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the calm in his eyes, the strange peace he carried in a land built on violence. Now, weeks later, that peace haunted her more than any sin she could name. She tried to tell herself that what happened between them meant nothing, that it was a mistake born from fear and confusion. But deep down, she knew that moment in the desert had been real. The kind of real that doesn't fade even when you want it to. One night, as she sat by the fire, she heard her husband's voice outside, low and angry. She went to the window and saw him talking to two men, riders from the neighboring ranch. They were armed, their horses restless. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to make her blood run cold. They were talking about a man spotted near the river bend, matching the Apache's description. One of the men said he'd found a trail of ashes, a small fire, freshly put out. Her husband's reply was hard and final. "If he's still breathing, we'll finish it this time." She backed away from the window, her hands shaking. She wanted to run out and stop him, to beg him not to go, but something inside her froze. What could she say that wouldn't give everything away? Her silence was her only protection now, and maybe his too. She spent that night awake, staring at the feather on the table, listening to the wind whisper through the cracks of the old house. The next morning, before the sun rose, she saddled a horse. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The ground was cold under her boots, and the horizon glowed faintly pink with the promise of dawn. She followed the dry riverbed west, past the old cottonwood tree where the land dipped into the canyon. The farther she rode, the quieter it got, till even the sound of her horse's hooves seemed swallowed by the sand. When she reached the canyon rim, she stopped. Down below, in the shadows, a small fire flickered faintly, a sign of life. She dismounted and walked the rest of the way, her steps careful and slow. And there he was. The Apache warrior sitting by the fire, his arm bandaged, his body tired but still strong. He didn't move when she appeared. He had heard her coming long before. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You're alive," she said softly. He nodded. "Your husband's bullet missed my heart." His voice was calm, without anger. "But it took a piece of me." She looked at the bandage, at the dried blood, and guilt burned through her. "They're looking for you," she whispered. "If they find you, they won't," he said simply. "I've lived longer in worse places." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Why did you come back?" He looked up at her, and there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Sorrow, maybe understanding. "Because I wanted to see if you meant it," he said. "Meant what? When you didn't pull away?" The words struck her harder than any gunshot. She didn't know how to answer because part of her didn't understand it either. She had lived her whole life by rules. What a woman should do, what a wife should say, how to pray, how to smile. But none of those rules had prepared her for the way she felt when he looked at her like that. Like she was more than just a name on a deed or a shadow behind a man's pride. The wind shifted through the canyon, and she could hear the distant call of riders. Her time was running out. "You have to go," she said. "They'll be here soon." He stood slowly, wincing from the wound, but his gaze didn't leave hers. "And what about you?" he asked. "Will you go back to him?" Her throat tightened. "I don't know." He nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. Then he reached into his belt and pulled out a small charm, a piece of bone carved with tribal marks. He held it out to her. "Keep this," he said. "It will remind you of the truth, even when you try to forget it." She took it, her fingers brushing his. The moment felt like a lifetime. Then he turned and vanished into the wild, the same way he had come. When she returned home hours later, her husband was waiting on the porch, his rifle across his lap, his eyes dark with suspicion. "Where were you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The wind carried the smell of rain, the first in months, and somewhere behind her, thunder rumbled over the mountains. The storm was coming, and she knew it would change everything. But for now, she just stood there in silence, the carved bone hidden in her palm. Her heart divided between two worlds that could never meet. The desert stretched endlessly behind her, and she had never felt more trapped or more alive. Rain fell that night for the first time in months, soaking the dust until it turned to mud, washing the blood-colored horizon clean. The thunder rolled across the valley like a drumbeat, steady and deep, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. She sat by the window, watching the storm. Her husband slept in the next room, his rifle leaning against the wall beside the bed. Every flash of lightning showed the sharp outline of it, like a warning that never left her sight. She couldn't rest. The memory of the canyon burned in her mind, the Apache's calm voice, the charm in her hand, the storm in her chest that refused to fade. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the trouble had not. The men from the neighboring ranch came again, this time with harder faces and faster horses. They brought word that two cattle had been found dead by the creek, arrows in their sides. The talk spread fast, whispers that the Apache tribes were stirring again, that revenge was coming. Her husband said little, only loaded his rifle and gave orders to his men to ride out and guard the boundaries. The ranch became a fort overnight, the women sent inside. The men watching the horizon like hunters waiting for prey. She knew what the others didn't. That the Apache warrior they spoke of wasn't leading a war. He was just trying to live. But no one in town would believe that. Fear had already chosen the story it wanted to tell. The next few days were heavy with tension. Horses neighed restlessly, and dogs barked at shadows. Every sound at night made her heart jump. She began to notice how her husband had changed, how suspicion now guided his every move. He watched her more closely than before, asked where she went, who she spoke to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was sharp, filled with questions that neither dared to ask aloud. At the same time, something strange began to happen to her. She started dreaming of the desert of open skies and quiet winds, of a man standing alone against the horizon. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night and find herself clutching the small bone charm, its edges smooth against her skin. It was as if the Apache's presence lingered somewhere just beyond the edge of her sight. Watching, waiting. One afternoon, she went down to the barn to fetch water. The air was still, the clouds low. As she filled the bucket, she heard movement behind her. Soft footsteps, steady and cautious. She turned, her breath catching, but it wasn't who she expected. It was the ranch hand, a quiet young man who had worked for her husband for years. His hat was pulled low, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the hills. "You shouldn't be out here alone," said voice low. She frowned. "Why?" "They're saying the Apache's been seen again," he whispered. "Near the old trail? Your husband's men are planning a search tonight. They want to find him before the soldiers do." Her heart dropped. The soldiers. He nodded. "Word's gone to Fort Dawson. The captain's sending a patrol tomorrow. If they catch him, it won't end well." The word struck her like a blow. She felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She knew she couldn't let that happen, not after everything. The Apache had saved her life, and now, in some strange twist of fate, it was her turn to save his. That evening, while the men prepared to ride, she slipped into the stable. The sky was deep red with the setting sun. She saddled her horse quietly, her hands trembling as she tied her shawl tight. She knew the risk. If her husband found out, it would destroy what little was left between them. But the thought of the Apache hunted like an animal burned stronger than fear. She rode fast, following the path west toward the canyon. The wind tore through her hair, and the air smelled of wet earth. The sky darkened quickly, the stars hidden behind thin clouds. When she reached the old cottonwood, she dismounted and listened. There was nothing, only the whisper of the wind and the faint rush of the river below. She called his name once, softly, not sure if he would hear. A shadow moved behind the rocks. Then he stepped out, his movements quiet as always, his face half hidden by the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "They're coming for you," she said quickly. "The soldiers, they'll be here by morning." He didn't look surprised. "I know." She stared at him. "Then why are you still here?" His gaze held hers for a long moment. "Because I have nowhere else to go." She stepped closer, anger and worry twisting together inside her. "You could leave, ride north, cross the river. There's still time." He shook his head. "My people are gone. The land is watched. If I run, they'll hunt me forever. If I stay, maybe the land takes me back." The words cut through her. There was no fear in his tone, only weariness, the kind that comes from losing too much for too long. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that he wasn't alone, that there was still something worth living for. But before she could speak, a sound broke the quiet, the faint creak of a saddle, the snap of a twig. Her blood ran cold. They weren't alone. She turned and saw movement on the ridge to riders, their rifles glinting faintly in the starlight. They were her husband's men. They must have followed her. "Go," she whispered. "You have to go now." But he didn't move. "If I run, they'll shoot. Then I'll stop them," she said desperately. He looked at her, his jaw tightening. "They'll kill you too." Before she could answer, a shout echoed from the ridge. "There, down by the rocks." The riders urged their horses forward, the sound of hooves pounding like thunder. She turned to the Apache. "Hide." He slipped into the shadows, vanishing among the boulders. She stepped into the open, raising her hands. The men rode down fast, mud flying from their horses' hooves. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, reined in sharply. "What are you doing here?" he barked. "You trying to warn him?" She forced her voice to stay steady. "I came to find you." "He's not here." The man narrowed his eyes. "You think we're fools?" We saw movement. The second rider dismounted, scanning the rocks with his rifle ready. The tension stretched thin as wire. She could feel the Apache's presence somewhere behind her, hidden, silent. If they saw him, there would be no stopping the bloodshed. Finally, she spoke again, her tone sharp. "You'll answer to my husband if you shoot without proof." The scarred man hesitated, his hand tightening on the reins. "Maybe," he said slowly. "But your husband ain't the only one tired of Apaches creeping near our land." He turned his horse, signaling to the other man. "Let's go. We'll come back at first light." When they rode off, she stood still until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did she feel her legs begin to shake. The Apache stepped out from the shadows, his eyes watching her carefully. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "They'll know now." "I don't care," she whispered. "I couldn't let them kill you." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You saved me again." "No," she said softly. "We just keep taking turns." As dawn approached, they sat together in silence, the cold wind cutting through the canyon. She could hear distant gunfire somewhere far off. The soldiers were coming. The Apache looked toward the horizon, where the land stretched wild and endless. "The world is changing," he said. "Soon, there will be no place left for men like me." She looked at him, her heart heavy. "And for women like me?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. When she returned home later that morning, her husband was waiting again, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He said nothing as she dismounted, just watched her like a man who no longer trusted the ground beneath his feet. The silence between them had turned into a storm of its own. She knew the line between truth and survival was thinning fast. The soldiers would be here by noon. And when they came, they would bring more than just rifles. They would bring judgment for the Apache, for her husband, and for the secret that bound them all together. The rain began again. Light but steady, falling over the valley like the last prayer of a dying land. And deep inside, she knew the real war was only beginning. The soldiers arrived at dawn. Their wagons rolled through the valley, churning up the wet soil, and the sound of their boots echoed across the yard like a warning. The flag on their lead horse snapped in the cold wind, its colors sharp against the gray sky. She stood on the porch beside her husband as they approached, her hands clasped tightly, her stomach hollow with dread. The officer dismounted, tall, stern-faced, his uniform still carrying the dust of the trail. He greeted her husband with a curt nod, his eyes scanning the ranch. "We've come on orders," he said. "There's been talk of an Apache seen near this property. We're here to find him before he finds trouble." Her husband nodded stiffly. "You'll find no trouble here," he said. But his voice lacked conviction, and she could feel the weight of his unease. The soldiers began to spread out, checking barns, fences, and the hills behind the creek. Each footstep sounded like a countdown. She wanted to scream, to stop them, to tell them they were chasing the wrong danger. But the words stayed buried under her fear as the soldiers moved through the property. She caught sight of the small charm still hidden beneath her blouse. It felt heavy now, not like a symbol of hope, but of consequence. Every secret has a price, and she could feel hers tightening around her like a noose. By midday, the soldiers found tracks leading north, faint but clear. The officer studied them, his expression sharpening. "He's close," he said. "We'll move by nightfall." Her husband followed him to the barn, his face unreadable. But she knew that look, the one he used to wear before a storm, before the drought took their crops, before the night he fired that bullet. A man holding too much pain and nowhere to put it. When darkness fell, torches lit the ranch. The soldiers prepared their horses, their rifles slung and ready. Her husband stood near the gate, speaking quietly with the officer. She watched from the porch, her chest tight. The night smelled of rain again, and the horizon pulsed with distant lightning. Something in her heart told her that this would be the night when everything would break. Unable to stay still, she slipped into the barn. The lantern burned low, and the air was thick with the scent of hay and damp wood. For a moment she stood there, breathing hard, her thoughts spinning between fear and guilt. Then she heard a sound, soft, deliberate. A figure stepped from the shadows, and she almost cried out before she saw his face. The Apache stood there, quiet as always, his eyes watching her with calm intensity. He was wounded still, but alive. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I couldn't go far," he said. "They've closed the trails." "You have to leave," she urged. "The soldiers are here. They'll find you." He looked toward the door, then back at her. "And if they do, they'll kill you," she said, barely holding back tears. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Then maybe it's better to face them than to keep running." She felt her breath catch. "Don't say that. You don't understand, my husband's with them. If he sees you—" He tilted his head slightly, studying her face. "Then it ends tonight." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, neither moved. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling closer. She could see the faint torchlight flickering through the cracks in the barn door. The soldiers preparing to ride. "I'll hide you," she said suddenly. "There's a place under the feed pit. No one goes there." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. As he stepped toward the hidden hatch, their hands brushed. It was only a second, but it was enough to bring back everything. The kiss, the gunshot, the unspoken truth that had tied them together since that night. When she closed the hatch, she could still hear him breathing below, steady and calm. She covered it with hay, just as footsteps approached the barn. The door creaked open, and her husband stepped in, holding a lantern. His face was grim, his eyes sharp. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I was checking the horses," she said quickly. Forcing a steady tone, he set the lantern down, the light casting long shadows. "You're lying," he said quietly. Her heart froze. "Why would I lie?" He stepped closer. "Because you've been hiding something since the night by the fence. I see it in your eyes. Every time I look at you, you're somewhere else." She tried to speak, but her voice failed. The storm outside raged harder, and the wind howled through the cracks. He glanced around the barn, his hand drifting toward his revolver. "If he's here, I'll find him," he said. Her stomach twisted. "Please," she whispered. "He's not," the sound of boots interrupted her. The officer appeared at the door. "We're ready to ride," he said. "If there's anything to find, we'll find it tonight." Her husband nodded, his eyes never leaving her. "I'll come," he said, then turned and followed the officer out. When the door closed, she fell to her knees, shaking. She pulled the hatch open. The Apache climbed out, his expression unreadable. "You can't stay," she said. "They'll be gone for a few hours. But if they come back and you're still here?" He looked at her. And for the first time, she saw something like sorrow in his eyes. "You risk too much," he said softly. "I don't care," she whispered. "I just want this to end." He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. "It will," he said, "but not the way you think." Then he turned and disappeared into the rain. The hours that followed were endless. The storm tore through the valley, and flashes of lightning lit the hills. She paced the floor, waiting for the sound of hooves, dreading it. When it finally came, it was not what she expected. A single horse galloped into the yard, riderless, its saddle wet and empty. The men shouted, running out into the rain. The officer grabbed the reins, his face pale. "It's one of ours," he said. They were ambushed. Her husband rode in moments later, mud-splattered and bleeding from a cut on his arm. His eyes were wide with fury. "He's not alone," he said. "There are others, maybe 5 or 6. They're moving north." The officer barked orders, and the soldiers remounted, torches blazing. Her husband turned to her briefly. "Stay inside," he said, his voice hoarse. Then he rode off into the darkness with the others. She stood on the porch, the rain soaking her dress, watching the lights vanish into the night. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She didn't know if the Apache had truly joined others, or if her husband was chasing ghosts born of his own fear. All she knew was that the desert was swallowing men again, just as it always had. The night dragged on. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the plain. Hours passed and no one returned. She lit a lantern and sat by the window, staring into the dark. Every flash of light made her flinch, imagining what might be happening out there then. Faintly, through the rain, came a sound hoofbeats. One rider, moving slowly. She ran to the door, heart in her throat. The figure approached, slumped over the saddle. When the lightning flashed, she saw his face. Her husband. He was alive, but barely conscious. She rushed to him, helping him down. His hands were trembling, his clothes torn. "They're gone," he whispered. "All of them." Ambushed near the canyon? It was him. Her blood went cold. "No," she said. "He wouldn't." "He did," her husband growled. "He's not the man you think he is. He's a killer, and he's coming back for you." She froze. The lantern flickered in her hand. The wind howled against the door, and somewhere beyond the hills. Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. Her husband leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "If he comes here, I'll finish it," he said, his voice low and final. "Once and for all." Outside, the storm raged louder, and in the distance, under the roll of thunder, came a faint, rhythmic sound like hoofbeats moving closer through the mud. She turned toward the window, her heart pounding. Was it the Apache coming for her, or the storm coming for them all? The night gave no answer, only the sound of the wind tearing across the valley and the steady beat of fate drawing near. The storm raged through the night. The sound of hoofbeats came and went in the distance. Sometimes real, sometimes imagined, until everything blurred into a single long heartbeat of fear. She sat by the window, holding a lantern, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Her husband lay near the fire, pale and shivering from exhaustion, the rifle beside him. His words echoed in her mind that the Apache was coming back, that he had killed the soldiers, that he would return for her. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the small hope that maybe he had escaped. But something deep inside her already knew this night would not end quietly. Hours passed, and the rain softened into a steady drizzle. Dawn began to break over the hills, gray and thin. The yard was a sea of mud, and smoke from the dying fire drifted through the cabin. Her husband stirred, his face tight with pain. "You should go to town," he muttered. "You shouldn't be here when it happens." She looked at him, her eyes hollow. "And leave you?" He turned his head toward her, his expression a mixture of guilt and pride. "You don't owe me anything anymore," he said quietly. I know what I saw that day by the fence. I tried to hate you for it. I still do sometimes. But hate's a poor thing to hold on to when the end's coming." She didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. They both knew the truth. Their marriage had died long before that kiss in the desert. The silence between them wasn't love anymore. It was something heavier, built from years of drought and loneliness. A sudden noise outside made them both look up. A horse whinnied, sharp and panicked. Her husband grabbed his rifle, dragging himself to his feet. She followed him to the door, her heart pounding. When they stepped outside, the air was cold and still. Across the yard, near the edge of the fence, a lone figure sat on horseback. The Apache didn't move, just watched them with the stillness of a mountain. His horse's breath steamed in the chill air. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow creak of the saddle and the drip of rain from the roof. Her husband raised his rifle. "You took everything from me," he said. "My men, my land, my wife." The Apache's voice was calm. "I didn't take anything. You were already losing them." Her husband's hands trembled. "You call this justice?" The Apache looked at him steadily. "There's no justice here, only the land. It gives and it takes." The tension between them felt like a rope pulled too tight. She stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Stop it, both of you. This won't change anything." Her husband didn't lower the gun. "You stay out of this," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't know what he's done." "I know enough," she said, tears in her eyes. "You shot at him once, and it didn't end anything. You kill him now, and it still won't. You'll just carry the ghost of it until you die." For a long time, no one moved. Then her husband took a shaky breath and lowered the rifle. "Then let him leave," he said. "Let him go, and we'll never speak of this again." The Apache's gaze shifted to her. "And if I go, will you forget?" She swallowed hard. "No," she said softly. "I'll remember." "But remembering isn't the same as staying." He nodded, slow and solemn, as if that answer had been waiting all along. He turned his horse slightly, rain dripping from his hair, and looked back once more. "The land will heal," he said quietly. "Maybe one day, so will you." Then he rode away toward the open hills, his figure fading into the gray horizon until he became just another shadow in the mist. Her husband stood there, staring after him, the rifle hanging limp at his side. The silence that followed felt deeper than any storm. Finally, he turned toward her, his voice low. "He's gone." She nodded. "Yes." He looked at her, and for the first time in years, she saw something human in his eyes. Not anger, not pride, but weary acceptance. "You'll leave soon too, won't you?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't know." He gave a faint, broken smile. "You should. There's nothing left for either of us here." Later that day, after tending to his wound and clearing what was left of the wrecked yard, she walked to the old barn. The air inside smelled of earth and wood, the same place where the lies had started and nearly destroyed them all. She stood there for a while, listening to the faint drip of rain on the roof, remembering how it felt when the Apache first touched her hand, not out of desire, but out of understanding. In a world built on fences and fear, he had been the only person who saw her as something more than someone's wife. By evening, the sky began to clear. The soldiers never returned. The land, scarred by the storm, lay quiet again. She packed a small bag, tucking the carved bone charm inside. It felt strange to leave the house she had built with so much hope. But sometimes, the only way to keep a memory alive is to walk away from it. Her husband watched from the porch as she mounted the horse. He didn't try to stop her. "Where will you go?" he asked. She looked toward the hills, where the sun was breaking through the clouds. "North," she said. "Maybe to the town by the river." "Maybe farther," he nodded. "You'll find something better." She wanted to tell him that forgiveness was coming too, that someday they might both find peace, but the words wouldn't come. So she just gave him a small nod and rode away. The trail stretched ahead, glowing faintly under the late afternoon light. Every turn of the horse's hooves carried her farther from the pain, but not from the memory. She thought of the Apache riding somewhere beyond the mountains, carrying his own ghosts, his own scars. Maybe he would find a home too, somewhere the world wouldn't try to erase him. As the sun sank low, painting the sky in red and gold, she stopped at the ridge and looked back one last time. The ranch was a small shadow now, surrounded by open land. She could almost see the figures, her husband by the door, the Apache riding through the storm, frozen in time. Like echoes of a life that had already passed, the wind brushed against her face, soft and cool. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the charm, and held it to the light. For the first time she smiled, not out of joy, but out of quiet acceptance. Some love stories weren't meant to last forever. Some were meant to awaken what had long been asleep: the will to live, the courage to choose, the strength to forgive. She closed her hand around the charm, turned her horse toward the horizon, and rode on. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, just like the desert wind, harsh, beautiful, and eternal. In the end, the land was the only witness. It remembered everything: the footsteps, the tears, the gunfire, the kiss. And though the people would fade, the desert would hold their story forever. Written in dust and rain, where love and loss met under an endless sky, T.